welcome everyone, and yes, the last talk of the year, which has been wonderful, and we've got some equally exciting topics coming up next year. Helen Sykes loves the written word and always has, and since graduating from Oxford and briefly working as a journalist, she has had a rich and varied career, particularly in the fields of information and educational publishing. She has also worked tirelessly in not-for-profit allied health charities with a commitment to education and community wellbeing. Helen's passion for literature has led her to becoming one of the founders of the State Library of Victoria's Women's Writers Fund, established in 2021, focusing on underrepresented female voices. This initiative is aimed at preserving and promoting the works of women writers from the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, contributing to a more diverse and inclusive representation in the literary world. The fund aims to redress the historical gender imbalance of women's writers. Though wonderful till now, the rare book collection of the State Library has largely been male-dominated. Please give Helen a warm welcome.
Thanks, Mary Lou. I'm Helen Sykes, and what do they say in addiction circles? My name is Helen, and I'm a book tragic. I was fortunate enough to grow up in Cambridge and do my undergraduate degree at Oxford. I did a degree in English literature and language, and that was the start of a lifelong love of books and literature, and I have to say, libraries. And that is the reason why the first slide in this presentation is not the State Library of Victoria, it is the Radcliffe Camera at the University of Oxford. That is where the English collection was housed, and that is where I did a lot of my study. And how could you not feel part of that continuum of learning and study when you got to work in a building like that? A couple of years ago, I started to wind back some of my professional work and came off a couple of the not-for-profit boards I was on, and was very interested in starting to do some arts philanthropy work. And a friend said, "Oh, you should go to the State Library, it's made for you, you're made for it, go on." And so I went in and I did a tour, and they were about to, or had embarked on a big renovation project. I wasn't particularly interested in being involved in the buildings, but they also were looking at doing something about expanding their original rare book collection. And for a book nerd like me, that was absolutely up my alley. And so I said, I am in. As Mary Lou has outlined what the Women Writers Fund is about, and I have to say that it has been a joy to be involved with it as a project. And one of the things I would like to do this morning is to introduce you to some of the writers and some of the beautiful books that we have been able to acquire. It was very fitting that the first acquisition with which I was involved for the Women Writers Fund was a first edition Virginia Woolf. When I finished my undergraduate degree at Oxford, I had 3 possible pathways to take, and one of those was to stay on at Oxford and do postgraduate work. And I seriously considered taking Virginia Woolf as my topic. Given that didn't happen, it's been a great joy to help the State Library of Victoria acquire 3 first editions of A Room of One's Own, Orlando and To the Lighthouse. Not only is Virginia Woolf one of the 20th century's most important modernist writers, among other things pioneering the stream of consciousness narrative method, but with her husband Leonard, she established the Hogarth Press in 1917, which was enormously influential in publishing other new writers of the time. With her sister, the post-impressionist painter Virginia Bell and others, the Woolfs formed the heart of what we now know as the Bloomsbury Group. Sadly, Virginia Woolf struggled with periods of mental ill health all her life, suffering from what we would probably now diagnose as bipolar disorder, and she committed suicide in 1941. A Room of One's Own is an extended essay published in 1929 based on 2 lectures Woolf gave at Newnham and Girton colleges in Cambridge. It's become a key definition of the creative woman's need for financial and physical independence in order to achieve their potential. In the essay, Woolf suggests that the relative absence of female fiction is the result of a lack of opportunity rather than an absence of talent, and that domesticity and child-rearing suppress women's ability to create. This first edition also has its original dust jacket designed by her sister Virginia Bell, making it particularly sought after. Orlando, shown here on the left, was published in 1928 and is widely recognised as a key work of modernist and feminist literature, exploring the concept of gender fluidity long before it was a topic. Dedicated to Virginia's love of Vita Sackville-West, whose androgynous personality inspired the character, Orlando is a poet who changes sex from man to woman and lives for centuries. To the Lighthouse was published in 1927 and broke new literary ground in its focus on female interiority and the complex tapestry of personal narratives within a family. This first edition also has its original dust jacket designed by Vanessa Bell. I have particular affection for this book. It was probably the origin of my interest in Virginia Woolf, as I studied it as one of my English A-level texts about 1,000 years ago. While my pathway into the Women Writers Fund was a literary one, it was always very important to me that the acquisitions we made represented all areas of women's intellectual and creative endeavour. And there's no doubt that two of the oldest and most important works in the collection are by someone very few of us would have heard of. What an extraordinary woman. This is Émilie du Châtelet. Émilie du Châtelet was a French natural philosopher, what we would now call a physicist, and mathematician working in the 1730s. Very unusually for a girl of her era, she was not only fluent in Latin, Italian, Greek and German, but also educated in mathematics and science. She was married off at 18, and after bearing 3 children to her husband, the Marquis, she considered her marital responsibilities fulfilled, and they agreed to live separately but in the same household. In 1733, at the age of 26, she resumed her mathematical studies and also began a relationship with the writer Voltaire, which continued until her death. Her stellar career was cut short in 1749 when she died from complications of childbirth, a career threat not enjoyed by men. Her translation of an expanded commentary on Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica was published posthumously in 1756 and is still the version used in France today. Her own philosophical masterwork, could you go to the next one? Institutions de Physique, Foundations of Physics, circulated widely and was translated into a number of languages, and she corresponded and debated with many leading mathematicians and thinkers of the time. This is a lovely slide because it shows some of the workings in her maths book. There are a number of pages that have these fold-out sheets with diagrams and so on. Absolutely extraordinary. It's only relatively recently that Émilie du Châtelet's extraordinary achievements have emerged again from under her historic dismissal as Voltaire's lover. But when we're still struggling in the 21st century to get enough young women into the STEM professions, it's wonderful to be able to show people these books from such a pioneering woman. This is Mary Wollstonecraft, one of our founding feminist philosophers and advocates of women's rights, writing in the second half of the 18th century. For a long time, Mary Wollstonecraft's scandalous life received more attention than her work. She had 2 lengthy open affairs with married men and an illegitimate child, Frances Imlay, before marrying the philosopher William Godwin, with whom she had a second daughter. Wollstonecraft was a prolific author. She published a number of books and pamphlets advocating the benefits of female education. She wrote novels, a history of the French Revolution, a conduct book, and a children's book, and was strongly influenced by the principles of liberty, progress, and rationality embraced by the Enlightenment. But it was her 1792 publication, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, that we really wanted for the collection. One of the earliest works of feminist philosophy. In it, she argues that, contrary to the views of the time, women are not merely property to be traded in marriage and produce children, but human beings vital to the workings of society and deserving of the same fundamental rights as men. She also continues to call for the rights of girls to an equal education and deplores the training of girls to focus only on beauty and outward appearance. It sounds depressingly familiar. And in another correspondence with the life of Emily de Châtelet, Mary Wollstonecraft died young at 38, 11 days after giving birth to her second child. That second child, Mary Godwin, is better known today as Mary Shelley, the precocious author of Frankenstein. Hers is a remarkable story. Raised by her anarchist philosopher father, William Godwin, and from the age of 4 by a stepmother who resented her and favoured her own daughter, Mary Godwin fell in love with the married poet Percy Shelley at the age of 16. With her stepsister Claire Clairmont, they fled to Europe, returning to England 2 years later with Mary pregnant. Her child, a daughter, was born prematurely and did not survive. The couple married in 1814 after the suicide of Shelley's wife, Harriet. They had 3 more children, but only one of whom survived to adulthood. In 1816, the Shelleys and Claire Clairmont went to Geneva to stay with the poet Lord Byron and his friend and physician John Polidori at the Villa Diodati. After days of rain, Byron proposed that they each write a ghost story to pass the time, and after several days without success, Mary Shelley mapped out the plot of Frankenstein in one night. This followed a discussion about galvanism, or the theory that a human body could be reanimated through electric shocks. She said the idea for the story came to her in a waking dream. I saw the pale student of the unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. It is an extraordinary work to come out of the mind of an 18-year-old. The first edition of Frankenstein was published anonymously in 1818, with an introduction by Percy Shelley, of course giving rise to the popular assumption that he was the author. This third edition, produced in 1823, was the first to appear with Mary Shelley named as the author, and so is particularly appropriate for the Women's Writers' Fund collection. It is also the first illustrated edition. This very ethereal, beautiful woman is Sylvia Pankhurst. Sylvia Pankhurst was an English feminist and socialist activist and writer, and the daughter and sister of the women's suffrage movement leaders Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, with whom she founded the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903. The WSPU believed that women had to do the work of emancipation for themselves and that they needed a movement free of party political affiliation. Sylvia was arrested multiple times for her role in WSPU protest actions and was a repeated hunger striker. She broke with her mother and sister's leadership of the WSPU in 1914 after a disagreement about whether the organisation should remain solely focused on suffrage. Sylvia Pankhurst was a lifelong advocate for the oppressed, who welcomed the Russian Revolution but rejected Bolshevik dictatorship and supported Irish independence. The Illustrated Revolutionary Journal she founded in 1923, Germinal, was a short-lived publication of which just 2 issues were printed. Named after Emile Zola's novel Germinal, Germinal was founded with the Italian anarchist Silvio Coraio, a trained printer and typographer with whom she had a long-term relationship. Each issue is introduced by Pankhurst and features fiction by Maxim Gorky, drama by Ernst Toller, and poetry by Anna Akhmatova, along with many other contributors. And the cover designs are by Ludovic Pizarro, son of the Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro. As fragile paper productions, copies of Germinal are very rare, and we have been fortunate enough to acquire both issues. And in fact, Fund co-founder Christina Campbell-Pritty, who some of you either may know or have come across, particularly for her donations of fashion and textiles to the National Gallery of Victoria, she has a really long-standing interest in the suffrage movement. And it was very interesting at the same time as I was talking to the State Library of Victoria about the concept of the Women Writers' Fund. She approached them. She had a big collection of suffragette memorabilia, both publications but also medals. She's got a Hunger Strikers medal and various other things. And she was looking for a place for it to go, and felt that the NGV was not the right place, but that the State Library was the right place. So the State Library of Victoria now has probably the best collection of suffragette artefacts, certainly in the Southern Hemisphere and possibly in the world. It's really extraordinary. I'm now going to introduce you to another person that probably no one's heard of, Mary Gartside. Tellingly, I could find no picture of Mary Gartside, yet another pioneer in her field whose work for many years was downplayed or forgotten. She was born in 1755 and so preceded photography. And even though she moved in art circles, she obviously wasn't considered important enough to have her portrait painted. So instead, we will have to appreciate her through these beautiful images of her work. Mary Gartside was an English watercolourist of some renown who exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1781, and she published 3 books between 1805 and 1808, ostensibly on the art of watercolour painting, but actually exploring her concept of colour theory, or the art of colour mixing and the visual effects of specific colour combinations. She was only the second person and the first woman to have written on the topic, and her work preceded the German poet Goethe's more recognised theory of colours, published in 1810. The work acquired by the Women Writers' Fund is a revised edition of her first book, An Essay on Light and Shade, published privately in 1805. This essay is one of the earliest to divide colours into warm and cool, and to focus on the sensory effects of colours and their various combinations, almost a philosophy of colour. And what we see here are some of the extraordinary hand-painted colour blots with which she illustrated the work. And I think they are extraordinarily beautiful, and to see them in the flesh, so to speak, they are even better than you see on the slides. And she's just disappeared from history. Relatively recently, an exhibition on watercolour refound her, and so her work on colour theory is now starting to get a bit more recognition. Only 10 copies of the 1805 edition are known to be in existence. This is the revised 1808 edition, but they are incredibly rare, incredibly rare. Mary Ann Evans, or George Eliot, as she is better known, was one of the leading literary voices of the 19th century. She was a novelist, poet, journalist, and translator. She grew up in provincial England, and most of her works are set there. Because she was not considered beautiful, she was not thought to have much chance of marriage, and her father made sure she and her sister Christiana were, for the period, well educated. Her personal life, and there seems to be a theme here, her personal life was unconventional. She lived at home as a good unmarried daughter. She lived at home as her father's housekeeper until his death in 1849, but from then on pursued her own path as a writer and independent woman. She met the philosopher and critic George Henry Lewes in 1851, and they began living together in 1854, though Lewes was already married, causing a significant scandal. And their relationship continued until Lewis's death in 1878. She referred to herself as Mary Ann Evans Lewes, though they never married. And after his death, actually changed her name by deed poll to Mary Ann Evans Lewes. Mary Ann Evans adopted the nom de plume George Eliot when she began to write novels, having published her journalism and critical work under her real name. While women novelists had started to be published under their own names by this time, she told her biographer that she wanted to escape the stereotype of women's writing being limited to light-hearted romance or other topics not to be taken seriously. Her first fiction was published in 1857 when she was 37, and her first complete novel, Adam Bede, in 1859. Interestingly, the success of Adam Bede forced her outing as its author after several other people claimed to be George Eliot. She's probably today best known for her masterwork, Middlemarch. The Women Writers Fund is in pursuit of a first edition Middlemarch, but they are both rare and incredibly expensive. It was quite interesting to me when I first got involved, and very chastening, that relatively how inexpensive some of these works were to acquire. I think the original, relative to elderly first editions, I think the first edition Room of One's Own, which is just such a seminal publication, I think we acquired for something like $10,000. First, depending on the fame of the author, some are more sought after than others, but it is chastening to know how little they were respected. Daniel Deronda is Eliot's last novel, appearing in 1876, and this is the one that we have been able to acquire for the Women Writers Fund. I know it looks as though it's fallen to pieces, but in fact the 4 volumes seen here are the first edition, and they were published as 4 unbound, in the sense of not having covers, 4 separate instalments. What tended to happen was that purchasers could then choose to have them bound themselves, but these are a first edition, and that is how they were issued. I couldn't come and talk in Queenscliffe without talking about Henry Handel Richardson. From Mary Evans, we move to another woman who chose to write as a man, Ethel Florence Lindsay Richardson, known to readers as celebrated Australian author, Henry Handel Richardson. Richardson was notoriously private, which is very interesting in someone who mined her own and her family's experience repeatedly in her work. Her coming-of-age novel, The Getting of Wisdom, describes her school days at Melbourne's Presbyterian Ladies' College, while her masterwork, The Fortunes of Richard Marnie, drew on her family's history and her own childhood. She married Scots scholar of German George Robertson in 1894, but her sexual orientation in general was lesbian. In a letter to her old school friend Mary Curnow, she says, "I always feel half a man, and I'm sure I went wrong in the making." Publishing 50 years after George Eliot, Richardson also chose to appear behind the mask of a male pseudonym, even though there was no longer a need. In an essay on Richardson's Myself When Young, Brenda Niles says, "Being Henry was essential to her sense of self. It was also her defence. She insisted that she needed a mask to hide behind, or a straw man to take her place against attack. With half a lifetime of being called Henry, even by her husband, it would be hard to unmask for the public." I'm happy to report that the State Collection has a number of first editions of the work of Henry Handel Richardson. They're not acquired by the Women Writers Fund, which I think must be why I have this Penguin Modern Classics illustration. And the library also has her typewriter. And then that is me. I do seem to have rather galloped through this, I'm sorry. My contact details, do feel free to get in touch. There are some brochures, I know, about the Women Writers Fund at the front. Also, I would like to say, if any of you would like to see some of these amazing works in the flesh, in the paper, quite a few are on display as part of the library's current World of the Book exhibition. So if you are in Melbourne and you have some time, I strongly recommend going and having a look. It's a free exhibition. And a lot of these works, the slides don't really do them justice. You won't be able to pick them up and handle them, I'm afraid. But it is such an opportunity to go and have a look. Thank you for having me. As I say, I got through it very quickly. But very happy to take any questions.
before?
The most expensive book, we were fortunate enough, after Christina and I were kind of the kick-off partners, and beginning of last year, the Helen Macpherson Smith Trust made a really significant donation to the Women Writers Fund to be used over a period of years, and that enabled the purchase of a first edition Jane Austen, which I think was about $85,000.
And how do you source them?
Very interesting. There are a number of specialist booksellers, a lot of them, as you would expect, based out of London. And the former head of rare books at the State Library, Des Cowley, and the current head, Dr. Anna Welch, spend a lot of time sort of looking. Most of them, the purchases are done through an antiquarian bookseller. Harrington's in London particularly, the State Library now has a very close relationship with. One of the great things about the establishment of the Women Writers Fund is that now places know that the SLV is looking, instead of them having to kind of trawl through sales dockets, etc. They are approached now quite regularly, which is nice. And where the books come from into the antiquarian dealers is quite interesting. It's sometimes a collector, deceased estate, sometimes collectors who might have two of something or want to sell one item to facilitate another purchase that maybe goes better with their collection. To the Lighthouse came to us. It's got a book plate in it that's William Beekman, who was we know was a very avid collector of all things Bloomsbury and particularly Woolf. And the bulk of his collection is in the New York Public Library, was given to the New York Public Library. And I think they sold this. He had two, and so they sold one to raise funds for purchasing elsewhere.
And there's books you won't buy. You know, people might think they're. What's the criteria?
I think it's obviously things that are not currently represented in the collection, and it's not all not all 18th and 19th century books. We do also have been able to acquire first edition Sylvia Plath. We've got some first edition Toni Morrison. You know, it's important in terms of building the collection for the future that more contemporary writers are also represented. I don't think there's anything we'd say we definitely wouldn't buy. We try to maintain as broad a spectrum as possible in the collection. As I say, my primary interest was in the literature side, but I do think it's incredibly important that women philosophers, scientists, political thinkers are also really well represented. Really, the concept is that we, at the State Library, you can showcase the whole spectrum of women's endeavour. The original collection, as you said in your introduction, was a wonderful thing. The gift to the library was a wonderful thing, but it was a product of its time, and that time was a very male sensibility. And so, I think it's incredibly important, the work to try and redress that balance and to show all people, but particularly young women, to have part of that sense that I had so strongly when I was studying at Oxford, of being part of a continuum of study and a continuum of achievement, and to see what is possible. And some of these women worked under extraordinarily difficult conditions. They were pioneers. They were not taken always seriously by their contemporaries. And I think it's incredibly important to demonstrate that endeavour lasts.
I'm just wondering, is there a focus on Australian, particularly early colonial or and late manuscripts, say unpublished manuscripts or theses, master's and PhD theses? Does that come from?
Interestingly, certainly it's important for the Australian writers to be equally represented. It's very interesting. In the original rare book collection, that was the one area, Australian women writers was one area where women were more adequately represented. For example, we didn't have to go out and try and find a first edition Henry Handel Richardson. The library already had several. The unpublished manuscripts is an interesting question. Can't really answer it. It's not something we've talked about at the moment. I think because we've been fairly engaged in trying to kind of catch up with the mainstream, if you like.
It's available now, but called Lifton.
Oh yes, Anna Funder.
Yeah, it's a bit controversial about George Orwell and how much impact his wife actually had on his writing, and it's a lot of criticism and a lot of praise, but it's an interesting read.
Yes, no, I've read it. We read it in a book group. It provoked very heated discussion, I have to say. Yes, no, but very interesting. And again, a downplaying of the achievement of a very talented woman.
So do you any women poets?
Yes, we do. I knew. We have several. Sylvia Plath, and there's another one whose name escapes me. Yes, we are trying to acquire some poetry.
Where you've got a book like the Mary Dark Side, where there are not many copies of it available anywhere, for people like me who might be interested in reading the content of that book and we can't pick it up and touch it, do you publish the content of very rare books?
We are having a discussion at the moment about about digitisation of some of these. I think that's incredibly important, and I'm quite keen to sort of push for that, because these are not books that people are ever going to be able to just pick up and flick through. And so I think there's the SLV have now got quite an active digitisation department, and I think over time it will unquestionably be important that these books are digitised. So they won't be published in the sense of being reproduced as a paper, but if people can kind of go online and have that experience of sort of basically flicking the pages, that's a work in progress, yes.
Helen, are there still undiscovered first editions at the State Library and more excitement for you, or you've got them all taped?
In the sense of in the current collection, or things we're still looking for?
What you're currently doing?
Oh, well, there'll never be enough. Yeah, no, we're certainly things that we are still searching for. It's, how long is a piece of string? We haven't got any first edition Bronte. As I say, my kind of area is more in the literary stuff, and I'm sure there's a lot in political thought and so on. First edition Bronte are very expensive. For a first edition Wuthering Heights, say, you'd be looking north of $100,000. So it's, there's certainly a wish list, but depending on funds. And sometimes there's also that kind of bang for your buck element. Like, if you have, say, $50,000 to spend and you can buy 3 things you really want that maybe are slightly less well known, is that a better use of donor funds than half a really well-known thing? It's an interesting debate always, and we sit around the table and have that conversation.
Why is it so important to have first editions? I would have thought, you need the money to have the widest purchasing power for all women's work.
I think the Women Writers Fund is focused very much on early editions. They're not all first editions, but early editions, because it's about building the rare book collection. There would be an enormous spectrum of women's writing that's available in the general collection, but it's about preserving the history and wanting the artefacts, the rare artefacts, in the rare book collection. Yeah, no, in the general collection, the State Library, women writers in all disciplines are very well represented. There's a great consciousness of making sure that that happens.
Is there an overlap with the library in Canberra, the National Library's Rare Books collection, which I know something about, but do you know, are they doing the same sort of thing?
Not that I'm aware of. Not in this sort of specific format. The SLV one's the first.
Good, thanks.
I'd like to make a comment about the times in which we live. I was a student at PLC and we were not allowed to talk about Henry Handel Richardson.
No, I'm sure you weren't.
We knew because people had mothers who were intellectuals and somebody brought a copy of Beginning of Wisdom to school and we had to hide it in a brown paper bag.
Oh, really?
Because if we got caught with it,
It was a big no-no.
yes. That's not all that long
No.
ago.
No. No. Thank you.